Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now. This episode of Then and Now was a recorded conversation on May 13th, 2024, between Professor David Myers and Professor James Gelvin. This event was sponsored by the UCLA Department of History.
Welcome, everyone, to Answering Your Questions About Gaza, a dialogue with historians. My name is Dr. Rose Campbell, and I'm the Assistant Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. The brutal attack on Israeli citizens by Hamas on October 7th, 2023 shocks the world. In the 7 months since that event, the Israeli government and military have bombarded much of Gaza, killing upwards of 35,000 Palestinians and injuring nearly 80,000 more at the last count, in what is said to be an attempt to eradicate Hamas and retrieve the hostages remaining in Hamas's hands. In recent weeks, the war has received renewed attention in the United States due to clashes between pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli groups on college campuses around the United States, as well as in other parts of the world. And in some cases, these have been exacerbated by extreme police responses. Today, we're going to be hearing from two UCLA history professors, Professor James Gelvin and Professor David Myers, about the ongoing war in Gaza, how events got to where they are today, and what we can expect for the future. So each of them will speak for a few minutes, just giving a little bit of background, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. Our first speaker is Dr. James Gelvin, who is a professor of modern Middle Eastern history here at UCLA. He has published extensively on the social and cultural history of the modern Middle East, and his book titled The Israel-Palestine Conflict, 100 Years of War, has been revised and updated several times, most recently in 2021. Professor David Myers is a distinguished professor and Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA. He has published multiple books on Jewish intellectual and cultural history and has written several op-eds calling for an end to the war in Gaza and return of the Israeli hostages.
Okay, I guess I'll get started. So I want to thank Jim Gelvin for the initiative to do this Q&A with the history department community. I know this is such a traumatic and trying time on campus, and many of you here are hurting, and I have immense empathy for you all, and hope that we can get ourselves to a better place. The main site of confrontation, of course, is not on college campuses in the United States, but in Gaza, and that's what we're going to devote our remarks to. I'm going to talk about three things. Just briefly reprise our understanding of the origins of the war, talk a bit about the conduct of the war, and then offer an assessment about how it's going. So there are many contextual circles in which we can place the events of October 7th, when Hamas and other Palestinian militants, together with some residents of Gaza, breached the border with Israel, attacked military bases, and then went on to invade and destroy 22 communities along the Gaza-Israel border, in the course of which 1,200 people were brutally murdered and 240 people were kidnapped. We can certainly understand this as part of as an act of venomous rage and deep, profound frustration after 57 years of occupation and 76 years after the Nakba in 1948, the dispossession of Palestinians in 1948. There are more immediate circles in which we can place this event, and I'll mention just a couple briefly. One is the 2020 Abraham Accords, which were the culmination of negotiations between Israel and a number of Arab countries, brokered by the United States, that led to normalization of relationships between Israel and a number of Arab states. But in those negotiations, the question of Palestine and Palestinians was left off the agenda. And one motive that may have inspired Hamas was the impulse and desire to return the Palestinian question to international attention. In the same vein, just thinking of Hamas's motives regionally and also locally, the attack may have been an attempt to reassert Hamas's role as leader of the Palestinian national movement as part of its ongoing struggle with the secular nationalist Fatah faction that stands at the center of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So these are a couple of circles in which we can understand the events of October 7th. I also want to mention the important backdrop from the Israeli perspective. So as you may recall, the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had been facing 10 months of mass protests over his efforts to dilute the power of the judiciary in Israel and concentrate power in the executive branch. This is really the latest phase in Netanyahu's attempts to remake the face of Israeli society in a more avowedly ethno-nationalist visage, something that he began to do when he assumed his second term as prime minister in 2009, a tenure which has continued for 15 years, with the exception of 1 year, 2021, 2022. The attention of Israeli political, and for that matter, military leaders during the 10 months of protest was elsewhere. Tens of thousands of reserve soldiers announced that they would not report for service, including a large number of fighter pilots. Military preparedness was down, and the attack took place on a Jewish holiday, as had the last major attack, surprise attack on Israel, which had occurred almost 50 years to the day before October 7th, 2023, that being the October 6th Yom Kippur war that began when Egypt invaded Israel on that day in 1973. October 7th, the attack was stunning. It was revealed near flawless execution and a near total failure of the vaunted Israeli military and intelligence services. And it triggered massive trauma, particularly for the Jewish majority in Israel, many of whom lost family in the Holocaust, which remains such an important touchstone of Israeli public culture. The Holocaust is a central rationale, really, for the existence of Israel. The attack also pointed up the vulnerability of Israel, the military vulnerability of Israel and of its population. And that sense of vulnerability in this context and others very often leads to redoubled efforts to reassert a sense of power, confidence, and deterrence. And so it's not surprising that on October 7th, Netanyahu promised that Israel would respond with mighty vengeance on that very day. And I would say that that rarely makes for good policy or decision-making. Many at the time said Israel had, in the international community, had the right to respond in the wake of such a heinous attack. I think many would now also say that Israel's military response, the one it chose, has not gone very well. So the declared aim was the elimination of Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, an affiliate of the Muslim Brotherhood, which runs the Gaza Strip. Within a week of October 7th, Israel began its campaign with a massive aerial bombardment of northern Gaza, that thin strip in the southwest portion to the southwest of Israel on the Mediterranean coast. 2 weeks later, on October 27th, Israel began a major ground invasion of Gaza that destroyed much of the infrastructure and residential buildings of northern, then central, and ultimately southern Gaza, and also set in motion the massive displacement of Gazans from their homes. It's estimated that 1.9 million Gazans out of a population of about 2.3 have been displaced. Most of the residents are descendants of the survivors of the Nakba, those who had been displaced in 1948. On November 21st, a pause took place in the fighting, an agreed upon pause that led to the return of 105 Israeli hostages and the release of several hundred Palestinians from Israeli jails. That lasted for 10 days. and then the war continued as it has since that time. The Israeli military has conducted its campaign from the north to the south, from Gaza City to Khan Yunis, and now to Rafah in the southern center of the Israeli-Egyptian border, which itself is now home, or had been until a few days ago, home to 1 million of those displaced Palestinians. Since Israel announced its plan to invade Rafah and began to 2 or 3 days ago, it's estimated 300,000 people who were in that city on the southern border have already been displaced once again, moving westward towards the Mediterranean coast. So what we know is what we have all seen and witnessed: massive destruction, loss of life, injury, starvation, and destruction of property. And it's against this terrible image that is in our mind that much of the world has urged and demanded that Israel not undertake a full invasion of Rafah, fearing that it would lead to many more deaths. Now, from the perspective of Israeli policymakers, it's widely believed that Prime Minister Netanyahu is in favor of continuing the war, not only to defeat Hamas, but because it allows him to remain in power, and it therefore forestalls the day of reckoning that he will face when the war ends over the government's failures to protect its citizens on October 7th. Some of you may also know that Netanyahu is on trial for bribery, and there's been a kind of pause in that trial, which will probably will accelerate when the war ends and the focus of attention returns to him. But I want to make clear that it's not just Netanyahu who supports the war. Those who are deemed to be more moderate than he in the war cabinet that he assembled, including 2 former chiefs of staff, Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, also have supported almost all of the war aims, as has the defense minister, Yoav Gallant. Meanwhile, amongst the Israeli public, there was, throughout much of the war, overwhelming support for it, especially amongst the Jewish majority, about 80% of the population. That's begun to erode. As of last week, in the latest poll that I saw, 56% of Israeli Jews favor a deal, that is to say, a ceasefire, that included within it the return of the hostages. For the 56%, the return of the hostages is the chief objective and goal at this point, not the conclusion of the war. I should note that today there's a profound sense of heaviness in Israel. It's Memorial Day, which recalls fallen soldiers. Many Israelis are thinking not just of fallen soldiers, but of the hostages and those who were killed on October 7th. And I think it's reasonable to assume that movement will continue in this direction, away from the aim of completing the war and toward the paramount objective of bringing home the hostages. So, by way of conclusion, how might we assess how the war is going? So, first of all, Israel's declared goal, which I mentioned a minute ago, of eradicating Hamas, has not been achieved. In the last few days, when Israel has begun first its targeted strikes on Rafah and maybe planning a much fuller scale assault on Rafah, as this has proceeded, Hamas has resurfaced in northern parts of the Gaza Strip, areas that had earlier been declared free of Hamas fighters. So this focus on Rafah has allowed Hamas to resurface in parts of the Strip where Israel had declared victory. So that goal has not been achieved. Second, the Israeli hostages have not been released. This is a hugely significant point in Israel, and increasingly so, as I suggested. The principle of the redemption of captives, known in Hebrew as pidyon shvuim, is an extremely important principle in Judaism, and many Israelis believe that Netanyahu is not interested in realizing that goal. Third, more and more Israeli soldiers are dying and getting hurt as the campaign continues. Fourth, Israel's standing in the world has fallen to a new low. Many hold it responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, which is the charge that the Republic of South Africa brought against Israel at the International Court of Justice, which is currently considering that charge. In addition, indictments, it is said, are being prepared against Israeli military leaders at the International Criminal Court. Fifth, Israel's relationship with its closest ally, the United States, is not good. After providing unconditional support for many months, the Biden administration in recent weeks has begun to express more public criticism of Israel's conduct of the campaign, and in the last week or so has decided to withhold offensive weapons, including 2,000-pound bunker-busting bombs, to prevent a full-scale invasion of Rafah. Just in the last day or so, Secretary of State Antony Blinken condemned the horrible loss of innocent life, his words, and declared that a full-scale invasion into Rafah would not eradicate or eliminate Hamas. Sixth, it's not all clear that Israel has restored its deterrence factor. Vulnerabilities have been exposed, its relationship with allies have frayed, and there are other potential war fronts, particularly in north, actually not potential. There's a kind of small-scale war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon that could heat up and would be far more destructive, if that's possible to imagine, than what we have seen so far. The potential for mass destruction on both sides is considerable. And of course, the prospect of a wider regional war with Iran lurks on the horizon. And finally, and perhaps most significantly, staggering, almost unimaginable damage has been inflicted on the residents of Gaza. The Strip is in a state of devastation without functioning services, people still buried in the rubble, in addition to the 35,000 or so who it is estimated have been killed. And along with that, there is no coherent plan for the day after that Israel, as the military occupier or the powerful party, should have at the ready. And this ranges from things like how to feed and house the displaced, hungry, and often starving residents of Gaza, to what political horizon there might be to break what seems to be the latest and most terrible round in the cycle of violence that has convulsed this region for so long. And so I would say that up to now, the war has actually been a great success for Hamas's leader on the ground in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar. He's placed Israel in a compromised situation, particularly in terms of global public opinion. By contrast, the Gaza war has been a military and political disaster for Israel, and of course, a staggering humanitarian catastrophe for Palestinians there. So is there a way out of this quagmire? Well, that is a key question, and I'm sure we'll take it up in our Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Myers. Let's start with our first question, David. We have two right now. Our first question is a little bit of a longer one, so I'll go ahead and read it out loud. From a class I took on international relations last summer, I remember that we used a case study on Israeli-Palestinian relations. The professor described how Israeli authorities and leaders of the PLO were brought to the table in Oslo, although not the Oslo Accords, and it was described that the PLO was leaned on to make serious concessions to Israel, which led to the PLO losing popularity in Gaza and subsequently Hamas seizing power. So the question is, this person is curious how accurate this account is overall, what the specifics of that situation were, and how that might be impacting the present conflict.
Right. So thank you for that question. I think the account you have brought us is largely accurate. The backdrop to this is in the early 1990s, back-channel negotiations began between members of the Palestine Liberation Organization and kind of second-tier staffers in the Israeli government in Oslo, Norway, that achieved at least a certain level of confidence among the negotiators that a more public round of negotiation could commence. And perhaps the most important symbolic marker of that stage in the process came in September 1993 when President Bill Clinton invited the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and the leader of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, to the White House, and sort of in a kind of famous scene, actually physically brought together these two longtime rivals and enemies, who then developed a friendship and engaged in negotiations until November 4th, 1995, when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing Jewish terrorist. The Oslo negotiations were fraught throughout. They led to some tangible results, like a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan in 1994. Israel did agree to cede some measure of administrative control over the West Bank, areas A and B, to the Palestinian Authority. There was one kind of structural imbalance in the negotiations, and that is that the PLO, Palestinian Authority, agreed to recognize the State of Israel, which it did as early as 1988, whereas Israel recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, but did not publicly call for the creation of a Palestinian state. And that kind of imbalance, I think, was deeply internalized by Palestinians, who also saw that the negotiations did not bring tangible changes in their daily lives. There were, by the way, a number of interesting successes in the Oslo peace process, like curricular revision on both Israeli and Palestinian sides. But by the late 90s, there was a sense of that the negotiations were in trouble. Part of this was this sense was promoted by none other than Benjamin Netanyahu, who from 1996 to 1999 served his first term as prime minister, and did relatively little to advance the negotiations. He was succeeded by former chief of staff Ehud Barak, who sort of tried to use his kind of military bravado to strong-arm Arafat into making the concessions that he believed necessary to a deal. And then in the waning stages of the Clinton presidency, up till the last days he left, President Clinton also tried to exert his influence on the two sides, and by almost all accounts, did so in full consultation with the Israeli side, but without consulting the Palestinians until a kind of agreed upon list of negotiating points could be presented to the Palestinians. So there was a certain imbalance there. Both sides, the Israelis and Palestinians, offer their interpretations of what went wrong. The Israeli perspective, as articulated by Ehud Barak, is that Yasser Arafat simply couldn't accept the prospect of a deal that would require compromises. Palestinians and a number of Americans involved in the negotiation process believe that there's a kind of recalcitrance on the Israeli side, or a highly ineffective diplomatic regimen that the United States used. What we do know is we can debate the reasons for the collapse of Oslo, but in its waning stages, and as a reflection of the deep frustration that Palestinians felt, a second intifada, or uprising, began in September 2000, and that was far more violent and was responded to with far greater violence than the first intifada that began in 1987. And in the wake of that, there was a very profound reckoning on the part of many Israelis, particularly the Israeli Jewish majority, who said, we tried to engage in negotiations with the Palestinians toward a peaceful solution. It didn't work, and now we see the true face of our enemy, and they were referring to a massive wave of suicide bombings that occurred between 2000 and 2005. And many Israelis said sort of we were delusional before and now sort of understand the harsh realities on the ground. And that was an important catalyst toward the rightward drift of Israeli politics, a rightward drift that Benjamin Netanyahu seized upon when he came to power again in 2009, and he has indeed pushed Israel further in that direction.
Okay, so we do have quite a few questions here, so I'm just going to bring up a few that are more related to your own expertise and things like that. Let's see. So let's start with, could you talk a little bit and elaborate on some of the origins of the tension between Israel and Palestine? Specifically, you had mentioned the 57 years of occupation and dispossession of Palestine in that area since 1948. If you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Well, that would entail a whole course, and indeed Professor Gelvin teaches such a course, and I offer seminars on this as well. Professor Gelvin teaches a lecture course on this. I mean, there are various starting points. One could begin in the 1880s when the first wave of Jewish immigrants made their way to the land they called Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, Palestine, as part of the first wave of immigration of the national liberation movement of the Jews, known as Zionism. That's how its first proponents understood it, as a movement of national liberation that would overcome the centuries and millennia of oppression of Jews in their existence in the diaspora, in exile. That brought the new Jewish immigrants into relationship, and a tension-filled one, with the native inhabitants of the land, the overwhelming majority of whom were Arab Christians and Muslims. By the time the Zionist movement began, the first wave of immigration in the early 1880s, there were somewhere between 500 and 600,000 residents of Palestine, the overwhelming majority of whom were Muslim. A smaller minority were Christian, and about 25,000 were Jews. Tensions continued to develop over the course of the first decades of the 20th century, between the Zionist movement and the local Arab population, which began to develop its own sense of distinctive local identity as Palestinian. What complicated the picture was the arrival after the First World War, actually in the waning months of the First World War, of the British as a kind of colonial overlord of Palestine. And the British remained in Palestine from 1920 until 1948. That period, 2022 to 48, was a period of very intense and growing tension and violence between the Palestinian and Jewish sides. The British understood at a certain point that they had only defeats ahead of them, and decided to pull out in 1947. At that point, the newly created United Nations took upon itself the task of trying to seek a resolution to the tensions on the ground between Jews and Palestinians in Palestine. They created a special committee on Palestine, which issued a report that called for the partition of Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. That proposition was put before the United Nations General Assembly on November 29th, 1947, and approved. And in the wake of that, a local war broke out between Jewish and Arab sides. The Jewish side, the Zionists, were relatively content with the partition proposal. The Palestinian side was outraged by it, insofar as it would grant the Palestinian population, then about 2/3 of the population of Palestine, 45% of the land of Palestine, which they thought to be not just unfair, but yet another ill-fated and ill-intentioned intervention by the West into Palestine. In the course of the conflict that began in late 1947, which really began as a local war between local Jewish and Arab Palestinian forces, which then lent itself to a second stage of the war when the newly declared State of Israel on May 14th, 1948, was attacked by a number of surrounding Arab countries. In the course of that conflict, which the Zionist side understood to be a war for liberation, especially insofar as it came on the heels of the greatest catastrophe ever to befall the Jewish people during the Holocaust. So there was intense motivation to achieve sovereignty and a sure measure of safe haven for the Jewish people. So over the course of that war, the Jewish and then Israeli side gained momentum and ultimately won the war. That war, known as the War of Liberation for Israelis, was also the war that led to the massive displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians, some of whom left because they feared what happened to others of their neighbors who were forcefully expelled. It's in that year that the term Nakba, or catastrophe, was applied to the Palestinian predicament in that year. So these are some of the important inflection points in the history of the relationship. One could go on and narrate the rest of it from 1948 up until the present. A significant year was 1967, when Israel conquered new territory, including large amounts of territory in which Palestinians, and particularly Palestinian refugees or their descendants, dwelt, and thus began what most in the international community call the occupation. But these are some of the key points that I would mention that sort of serve as the backdrop to the deep sense of frustration and anger on the part of Palestinians who, from 1948, have been displaced, and then in 1967 were again displaced by Israel, and against whom many have very significant grievances. Israel, for its part, believes that it is committed to upholding the right of Jews to have a place of safe haven in what they regard as the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. So you have two peoples making powerful claims to land, powerful claims to indigeneity, and the question that hovers in the future, considering that one day this terrible, terrible war will come to an end, is can there be any equitable division or power sharing that will break this terrible cycle of violence?
Thank you so much, Professor Myers. It looks like we might have Professor Gelvin calling in. So do you want to go ahead and share your opening remarks, since you weren't able to do so at the beginning?
I'd be happy to. On October 7th of last year, there was an attack on Israel by Hamas militants. They crossed over, killed approximately 1,300 Israelis, and they took another 253 hostage. Now, we don't know for sure exactly why this happened, but if history is any indication, Palestinian factions have used terrorism to accomplish three ends overall. First, to keep the Palestine issue on the front burner. Second, to prevent any agreement that might undercut Palestinian aspirations. And third, to score points off rival factions. In this case, that rival faction would be the Palestine National Authority, the PNA, the PA, and that rules in the West Bank. If this was indeed any of these was the purpose of the Hamas attack, they accomplished their war aims. In other words, what Hamas has been able to do has been to derail any sort of negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, for example, and other Arab states that would put the Palestinian issue on the back burner and make the security of Israel and those other states the most important issue in the Middle East at the contemporary period. So immediately after the attack, Israel struck back, and then 3 weeks later launched a ground invasion of the Gaza Strip. Now, even before the Israeli invasion, the situation in Gaza was dire. Gaza is very poor, very overcrowded. I'm sure you've heard that before. There's about 2.2 million people who live in a territory that's only 24 miles long. It is the fifth most densely populated territory on Earth, with a 65% poverty rate. The poverty is due to bad governance on the one hand, but mostly it's due to an Israeli blockade, which was first imposed in 1991, then off and on, and then reimposed with a vengeance, actually, in 2007, after Hamas took power in Gaza. As of last week, there have been 35,000 fatalities in the territory. Most of them are civilians. And probably another 10,000 are buried underneath the rubble. There are 2 million displaced people, and 1.1 million Gazans face catastrophic food emergencies. This has already begun to take place according to the World Food Program. Now, the Israelis have two announced war aims. First is the destruction of Hamas, and the second is the release of the hostages that were taken. The destruction of Hamas has priority, and this is fairly apparent. This is why the ceasefire deals have failed, because the Hamas wants to make those ceasefires to be permanent, which means that Hamas would survive. Israel refuses to agree to a permanent ceasefire, and even at the expense of the hostages. The destruction of Hamas, which is the main Israeli goal, is probably not in the cards. It's probably not going to be possible. Hamas is totally embedded in the territory. It's got a huge patronage network. It's got about 35,000 employees in the Gaza. And you have to remember that Hamas started out as a charitable and welfare organization and has maintained many of those functions to this very day. Already, Hamas is retaking territory that it had been thrown out of in the north, in the area of Jabalia and Zaytun. So that even when the Israelis managed to clear Hamas out of a given territory, Hamas has been able to reemerge there. And finally, in terms of the destruction of Hamas, how would we ever know that Hamas has been destroyed? That, basically the Israelis are going by a body count. So far, it's been pretty much stalled at around 13,000 Hamas fighters they claim to have killed. And yet we know how unreasonable it is to look at the destruction of a political movement by looking at a body count from Vietnam. So it's very likely that Israel is not going to be able to meet its most important war aim. But publicly, Israel has announced two war aims, the destruction of Hamas and the release of the hostages. Actually, there are three. And the third war aim is to keep Netanyahu out of jail. Netanyahu is in serious trouble in Israel. He is the attack on Israel from Gaza took place under his watch. He was involved in enabling the Hamas government by allowing the Qataris to deliver to Hamas amounts of money that has been subsequently used for the purposes of this invasion, for example. So he's in trouble in Israeli society. He's also in trouble with his own government because his government consists of the most extreme right-wingers and religious zealots that are on the political spectrum. And they want nothing less than the continuation of the war and the destruction of Hamas. So if he does anything that's going to compromise that, the government will likely collapse and he will not survive. He's under indictment now on 3 counts of corruption, and it's very likely that should his government collapse, he'll be out of the government and then he will basically be up on trial. So Netanyahu has had to demonstrate that he's unyielding and that he's indispensable. And this has manifested itself in a number of ways. For example, biting the American hand that feeds him, to demonstrate to Israelis that he is willing to stand up to Israel's staunchest ally, in spite of himself. Let me just say one thing about what's going on in terms of the American situation as far as the conflict is concerned. Recently, Biden has cut off some aid to Israel, some military aid to Israel. Biden is still a staunch Zionist. He describes himself as such. He came to office as senator during a period of time in which Israel was still run by a social democratic party. So he associates Israel still with the values of social democracy. He supported Israel to the hilt in this battle, mainly to have some form of leverage over Israeli policy. He kept on with that leverage for far too long, even after it was demonstrated that any sort of American qualms about the way Israel was pursuing the war, the Israelis would not listen to the United States in doing that. So last week was the first attempt to exert that leverage, but it was not the first attempt that the Americans have used weapons transfers in order to leverage Israeli policy. It was first done in 1975 under the administration of Gerald Ford, and then it was done 3 times actually under the Reagan administration. In 1981, when Israel bombed the nuclear reactor in Iraq, and then in 1982 and 1983 during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. So the Americans have used it before. Those commentators who are talking about a total, shift now in America's relationship with Israel are mistaken, because fundamentally the interests of the United States and Israel coincide to too great an extent to allow that to occur on a permanent basis. So what's the likely end of this conflict? The likely end is that Israel will at some point declare victory and leave. And then we'll be stuck back with a policy of mowing the lawn, which is that every once in a while, Hamas will fire rockets once again into Israel, and Israel will respond with overwhelming force against Gaza. And this will continue into the indefinite future. The Israelis at this point have rejected, the Israeli government has rejected any move towards a 2-state solution. The Israeli population agrees with the government. About 65% of the Israeli population agrees that the Palestinians should not be, quote unquote, rewarded for October 6th by getting sovereignty, as if sovereignty is some form of reward that can be bestowed or not bestowed.
Thank you so much, Professor Gelvin. So we have a few questions that I'm going to combine here that are asking about the role of the U.S. and why the U.S. has been backing Israel for so long, except perhaps for economic interests. And also a few questions asking what will happen if we in the U.S. do cut ties with Israel? How will that affect our relationship with them and the overall situation?
Well, the United States is not going to cut ties with Israel per se. We have reduced delayed certain types of weapon systems, including, in the past we've done certain types of bombs, and this time what we're doing is we've delayed the delivery of 2,000-pound and 500-pound bombs. along with certain kits that are applied to jets in order to make dumb bombs smart bombs. On the other hand, the United States is probably not going to go beyond that in terms of defensive weaponry to Israel. The weaponry that was used several weeks ago to shoot down 300 missiles from Iran. So that the United States is not going to sever its relationship with Israel as well, as that occurring. I think more and more what the Biden administration is seeing Netanyahu as being as sort of like an outlier to the whole history of American support for Israel. Somebody who's certainly willing at this point to sacrifice American support or direct American support for, to be blunt, his own political ambitions and his own interests. As far as the overall American reasons for support for Israel historically, it's been multiple reasons. There's ideological reasons, there's domestic political reasons. Probably the most important has been American interest during the Cold War, that Israel was perceived as a strategic asset in the Cold War. That term actually was used for the first time during the Reagan administration. But even before and after that, the United States perceived Israel to be a strategic asset. Israel has presented its case well in the United States and has sort of like created this narrative among most Americans as being the only democracy in the Middle East and fighting for shared values, which increasingly has come under a great deal of strain simply because the values that many in the government hold, the Israeli government now hold, are certainly not the values that the United States would like to see projected globally.
Rose, I may jump in on that if I can. I want to affirm what Professor Gelvin said about the constancy of American support, but the constancy doesn't mean that it's been without change in a kind of paradoxical way. So the policy of support for Israel since the 1960s has largely been in place, but the characters who uphold it have changed. In an earlier era of that relationship, it was actually the Democratic Party that was the chief supporter of Israel and of the alliance between the United States and Israel. And as we have seen in recent years, that has begun to flip. There are important expressions of dissent from the orthodoxy of unquestioned American support for Israel within the Democratic Party, and we see more of sort of that unquestioning, unconditional support on the Republican side. What I think is important to note are two things. One, as Jim mentioned, there have been previous instances in which the United States government has actually drawn a hard line. A few isolated instances in which the United States has drawn a hard line with Israel, and in a certain sense, departed from that unconditional support. And those instances have actually been effective in pushing the Israeli government to make changes. And it's not surprising that a friend and colleague of mine by the name of Nathan Thrall has written a book that sort of makes this point called The Only Language They Understand, referring to the relationship between the United States and Israel. What we have seen of late is not just members of the most sort of progressive element of the Democratic Party, the Squad, criticizing Israeli policy and questioning unconditional American support. We've seen at least a dozen senators, United States senators from the Democratic Party, call for one form or another of the conditioning of aid, particularly the withholding of offensive weapons to Israel. And that's, in fact, what the Biden administration did belatedly, all too belatedly, in the last week or so. This growing willingness on the part of some Democratic senators, I think, coincides with a very significant shift, a kind of tectonic shift that is emerging on the American political landscape, and that's a generational shift. In the last poll I saw, and I'm sure there's more recent, from January, I think 55 or 54% of Americans over the age of 65 supported President Biden's policy on Israel, whereas amongst people under the age of 30, 72% opposed it. And I think that number has probably grown even further. So in addition to, and probably closely connected to the fact that Democratic senators are beginning, and a larger number of Congresspeople are beginning to call into question the principle of unconditional support, we see this very potent generational shift occurring with very real political consequences. It seems to me that President Biden has sort of wagered in terms of his own political future on sort of the establishment position at the expense of the younger generations. And it also seems to me that that is a very significant and potentially colossal miscalculation on his part. Yes, indeed, he is an oft-declared Zionist. He also has grown to dislike Bibi Netanyahu intensely. There are many points along the way that caused him to dislike Bibi Netanyahu, but nothing more than the past 7 months when the Netanyahu government has repeatedly rebuffed any requests or demands from the United States. Those requests have been largely toothless until recently. But when it comes to the lack of supply, calling off the provision of offensive material, artillery shells or 2,000-pound bombs, or equipment to help repair jet fighters, these can have real material consequences. And I think that's something that may well continue, certainly will be played out over the next quarter century as that generational shift asserts itself on the American political landscape. It may be too little too late for Biden in terms of his electoral chances. But there's certainly a very important shift underway generationally and within the balance of forces between Republicans and Democrats.
All right, thank you both. So again, I'm going to combine a few questions, but if you could talk a little bit about what Hamas is, if it's a political or a religious or military organization, and also to what extent Hamas actually represents the Palestinians, if Hamas is using the Palestinians or does not represent the populace, if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, Hamas is an organization that was founded in 1987 during the First Intifada, the first uprising against Israel. It started out from various charitable and welfare organizations that were catering to the Palestinian population in the territories in the West Bank and in Gaza. And in 1987, it adopted a military policy as well, violent rejection of Israel. Sort of had a military wing. The First Intifada, by the way, remained mainly nonviolent until the end. The Second Intifada, in which Hamas played a very important role, was a violent insurrection against the Israeli occupation. Whether it's a religious organization or a nationalist organization, these are categories that don't really square with what Hamas is. It's both. It seeks to recover all of Palestine from Israel, to establish a state, a single state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which it would be guided in terms of social mores and law by Islamic law and Islamic social mores, or what Hamas perceives to be Islamic law and Islamic social mores. So it combines sort of the certain religious aspects with the nationalist aspect. At its heart, it's a nationalist movement. It looks for the liberation of Palestine, works for the liberation of Palestine, but that liberation would also consist of a moral regeneration of Palestine along Islamic lines. In this, it is not that different from religious Zionism, for example, which also seeks a single state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. as part of its covenant with God, or the Jewish covenant with God. The Jewish covenant with God, as far as Hamas is concerned, is the equivalent of their Palestine being an Islamic endowment from God. So you can see the parallel between both groups there. Both are nationalist organizations that use a religious rhetoric as a cultural marker, as a marker of what the nation is all about. So, I mean, that's fundamentally what Hamas is. Hamas's original charter called for the elimination of the state of Israel. Its second charter in 2017 is more ambiguous. It calls for the elimination of Israel, but it also says that Hamas is willing to go along with the national consensus, whatever that means. And the national consensus was working towards some sort of accommodation towards a two-state solution at the time. So this is sort of ambiguous, but it's fundamental that Hamas has demonstrated what its coloration is as of October 7th. Whether Palestinians support Hamas or don't support Hamas, the problem is that first of all, there's been various polls that have come out. None of them are believable. Simply because, well, for two reasons. Number one, polling itself is highly fluid, so it depends on the circumstances. And number two, that in Gaza, it's very, very difficult to make sure that people are telling you what their honest opinions actually are when they're being asked by a pollster about Hamas. There's been several polls that have showed a diminished support for Hamas in Gaza. At the same time, there's been several polls that have showed a larger support for Hamas in the West Bank. As I said, these polls are really not quite believable. One further thing is the relationship of Hamas with the Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Authority is actually a legal structure, a structure in the West Bank now, that is made up of a group of factions within the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. So you have the PLO, the largest group within the PLO is Fatah, and that actually is the largest group within the Palestinian Authority, which is recognized as the negotiating arm and the administrative arm of the Palestinians in those territories that Israel has withdrawn from in the West Bank. So the relationship between Hamas and Fatah has never been very good. Hamas always refused to join the PLO. The PLO was recognized as the sole legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people in the 1970s, and Hamas stood outside of that since its inception in 1987, wanting to keep it as independent as possible. Hamas rejects the Oslo Accord, which would be the precursor of a two-state solution, and instead basically has pretty much stayed antagonistic to Fatah. I always compare it to a couple that's on the verge of divorce, that half the time they spend talking about reconciliation and half the time they spend trying to kill each other. Hamas was able to take over, well, the Fatah won the presidency of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, in 2005. Hamas was able to win the elections for parliament in 2006. And in 2007, there was a brief civil war between the two groupings, and Hamas took over in Gaza, and the Fatah took over in the West Bank, and that's where it's been ever since.
All right, thank you. So could one of you, and perhaps Professor Myers, this is more a question for you, could you talk a little bit about the relationship between Zionism and the current Israeli government, as well as the rhetoric right now around anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and how those are different or similar?
Okay. Well, those are two different questions. You may have to remind me of the second one as I jump into the first. So Zionism was, as I mentioned at the outset, a movement devoted to the national liberation of the Jewish people, and in particular to rescuing them from a state of oppression and ignominy in which they dwelt in the diaspora. It was a minority movement at its outset within the Jewish world, a very small minority movement. It's important to note that Zionism was born in multiplicity. There never was a single Zionist vision. I mentioned those first settlers who made their way in the 1880s to Palestine. They were committed to working the soil of what they understood to be the ancestral homeland, but they did so before the term Zionism even existed. It didn't come into existence until 1892, and the most prominent form of Zionism to take rise in the decade after was called political Zionism. It was not so much concerned with tilling the soil of the ancestral homeland. It was committed to using whatever means necessary to persuade global leaders, diplomats and politicians, of the virtue of creating a state for the Jews. This was the vision of the founder of political Zionism, a man by the name of Theodor Herzl, the creation of a state of the Jews, based on the belief that this was essential for the preservation, the physical survival of the Jews in the face of rising tides of anti-Semitism, especially in Europe. But shortly after Herzl articulated his vision, at least three competing visions of Zionism took rise: cultural Zionism, religious Zionism, and socialist Zionism, which sought to create small egalitarian farming communities in Palestine as a way of realizing the Zionist vision. And there were intense intramural battles between competing Zionist factions. The two main ones, as we move further in time, after Zionism moves from Europe to Palestine in the second and third decades of the 20th century, we see very intense battles between competing Zionist factions in the 1920s and 30s between the heirs of socialist Zionism, known as the labor Zionist movement, and then a kind of successor to the political Zionists called the Revisionist Party, which insisted on a degree of territorial maximalism. It called for a Jewish state to occupy not just all the territory from the river to the sea, but also the east bank of the Jordan River. That party was the precursor to the Likud party of Benjamin Netanyahu. And I would suggest that really since 1977, when the Likud threw off 30 years of rule by the Labor Party from the origins of the State of Israel, from the creation of the State of Israel, Israel has essentially been under the spell of that right-wing vision. It's also important to note that that right-wing vision was propelled forward by developments in 1967, not only because Israel conquered new territory that sort of led many to believe that the victory in 1967 was an act of divine intervention, but because that sort of wrapping of territorial conquest in religion provided immense momentum forward for the religious Zionists, who have become a dominant presence in Israeli political culture, not by virtue of their numbers, but by their willingness to organize and fight for their position within Israeli political culture. So we have the most extreme version of religious Zionists in the current Israeli government. They are represented by a party called Religious Zionism. And because of the parliamentary system in Israel, the 14 seats or so that they hold in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, that help make up Benjamin Netanyahu's 64-seat majority, give them enormous power, and indeed help explain why Netanyahu, in addition to his own craven personal interests, is insisting on moving forward with the war. Because if he were to pull back, it would immediately create a political crisis within his coalition, and those 14 seats those 14 members of the government might walk, in which case there would be a new election. Netanyahu would, in all likelihood, be voted out, and he would be subjected once again to the accelerated pace of his bribery trial. In many regards, let's say most Israelis, certainly most Israeli Jews, believe that Zionism was realized with the creation of the state in 1948. Those who hold to a different view are religious Zionists who believe that God's full plan has not been realized, and that they must continue to gain more territory over all of the ancestral or biblical land of Israel. As Professor Gelvin mentioned, and as I just suggested a minute ago, they are an enormously potent force. Again, not because of their absolute numbers, but because of the fervency of their advocacy and the structure of the Israeli political system. Okay, the question of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is a whole story unto itself that would require another hour. What I would begin by saying is it's my view that anti-Zionism is not by definition anti-Semitic. That, however, is not the view of what has become the dominant definition of anti-Semitism, a definition that was formulated in 2015, 2016 by something called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA. The IHRA definition, which includes a number of contemporary examples of anti-Semitism, really pushes the equation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And that definition has been enshrined in, the recently passed congressional bill, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Bill, just last week. It's been enshrined in law in, I think, over 35 states in the United States, by governments elsewhere in the West. And it has elicited or drawn very considerable criticism. And there are two competing definitional schemes that I'd call to your attention, since we're not going to have time to exhaust this subject. One is the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which was produced by a group of prominent scholars of Jewish history, Israel studies, and the Holocaust, which very clearly delineates between instances in which anti-Zionism can verge on anti-Semitism, and many instances in which it does not. So, for example, to call for the replacement of Israel as a Jewish state by creating a state of all citizens, according to the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, is not anti-Semitic. That a principled opposition to Israel as a Jewish state, which is a classic anti-Zionist point of view, is not, by definition, anti-Semitic if you hold or call for the creation of a state of all citizens. That's a political vision that is different from the vision of Israel as a Jewish state or a state of the Jews. And that can be debated. And the JDA, the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, says that is not anti-Semitic. The other definitional apparatus or scheme is the one produced by the Nexus Project, which also tries to delineate carefully where anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitic and where it doesn't. So, for example, denying to Jews the right to consider themselves a people, or denying the Jews any historical connection to the land of Israel, or ascribing to Jews in the diaspora or anywhere in the world guilt for the actions of the government of Israel. These are all instances that that Nexus and the JDA these are all instances that may reflect a blurring of the boundary between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. But I'd say a very good place to start in order to get a more nuanced sense of the differences, as well as the instances in which there is overlap, are these two other definitional schemes: the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism and the Nexus project. Interestingly, both of which are mentioned in the White House National Strategy on Anti-Semitism. Significantly, the White House did not acknowledge the IHRA definition as the only legitimate definition of anti-Semitism, with its very clear equation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
All right, so I think we'll wrap up with one final question, and this is for both of you, if you're able to contribute. Combining a few here, do you think that Hamas or the Israeli government will agree to any type of ceasefire or return of the hostages? Is there any possibility of a two-state conflict after this is over? And what do we see for the future? It's a big question, but if you could speculate on that a little bit.
The negotiations themselves for a ceasefire have been beneficial to Hamas because what they've done is put Hamas on equal footing as the Israelis. They also, in the most recent case, have made the Israelis seem totally intransigent, in spite of the fact that there can be, it's fairly evident that what was going on was that the Hamas was putting the Israelis into that position. The question of the ceasefire and the exchange of hostages is very, very different for both sides. That basically the bottom line for the Hamas is that they want a permanent ceasefire in exchange for the exchange of the hostages. The Israeli side thinks that a permanent ceasefire would enable Hamas to avoid its destruction. And so therefore, since that is the most important war goal for the Israelis, they don't want that. And that was a big stumbling block, along with other stumbling blocks, like whether or not the definition of hostage means live hostages or dead hostages included among the number of those who would be exchanged. So that's the stumbling block for the ceasefire. As far as for a two-state solution, it's not in the cards right now in terms of short-term or even medium term. There's too many people on the Israeli side who are opposed to a two-state solution. As I said before, the discourse, the narrative, the way narrative has developed is it could have developed along two lines. It could have been that there is no military solution, that this situation has demonstrated the fact that there is no military solution. The fact that Israel is not going to be able to destroy Hamas demonstrates that there is no military solution. The fact that Hamas is still committed to the destruction of Israel demonstrates there is no military solution. So there has to be a political solution. The two sides have to sit down together and figure out a way of actually implementing a two-state solution. Although there are elements on both sides that would prefer a one-state solution to a two-state solution. Either a one-state solution with equal rights for both Jews and Palestinians on one hand, or those in which one side or the other would either be repressed or expelled. What's going to probably happen, though, is that the question will be deferred for a long time, that neither side at this point is prepared to sit down and to discuss it. The other narrative arc is that the Palestinians do not deserve a state that would reward them for what took place on October 7th. And that's the one that appears to be, at this point, hegemonic within Israel. So the idea of a two-state solution, which would probably be the only viable solution for getting out of the situation and for ultimately transforming the question to eliminating the problem that there is now, will be deferred. The Americans, on the other hand, are still behind a large-scale solution that would include making peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia in exchange pretty much for a Palestinian state. The Americans would be prepared to give the Saudis a defense pact, which the Saudis want, and a nuclear deal, which would allow for hopefully peaceful uses of nuclear energy on the part of the Saudis. And in exchange for that, the Saudis would sign onto a normalization agreement with the Israelis if the Israelis commit themselves to an eventual two-state solution, or at least taking steps towards a two-state solution. Now, that deal is probably going to be finessed in a way that will allow the Saudis to bypass the whole Palestinian part of the equation and the Israelis as well, so that the Israelis may at some point say, we will undertake concrete steps towards the creation of a Palestinian state, and then basically drag their feet, as most Israeli governments have done on Oslo, for many years now, since at least 2016. So the prospects for a two-state solution in the near or medium term is not very good. But in the long term, it's probably the only way that the region can get out of this particular mess.
I'll just add very briefly, I've been wrong on many occasions over the course of the last 7 months about when this conflict would come to an end. What I did ask on October 9th was, would this stunning attack by Hamas, this sort of massacre, deliver a jolt to the system in ways similar to that jolt to the system that occurred in 1973? Could this push Israelis and perhaps Palestinians out of the paradigm of endless struggle, as indeed occurred in the case of Egypt and Israel? So we don't have the same factors in play. We don't have two recognized states. We don't have the same kind of conflict that ensued between them. But I did ask that question, and I do wonder, and I think it's too early to know about whether this might be a jolt to the system that prompts Israelis to say this is just madness. It might have the exact opposite effect, as it seems to have had over the course of the last 7 months. We do know, as I said, that growing numbers of Israelis, 56%, are now saying, bring the hostages home. That's the number one priority, not finishing the war. I think that's going to continue to grow, and that will exert an ever more important influence on government decision-making, and may lead to rifts within the war cabinet, rift between Netanyahu on one hand and Eisenkot and Gantz, the two former chiefs of staff, on the other. I think I agree with Jim that there's not much basis for hope for a political solution that would bring justice and equality to Palestinians, which I think is the next essential step to be taken, and security to Israelis. But I would just call attention to the possibility that in the not too distant future, we may see 4 factors that could alter our understanding. Whether or not they lead to dramatic transformation, I don't know, and I doubt. But these are important factors that, if they converge, can present a different picture. They are: 1, a new Israeli prime minister, sort of to be rid of Netanyahu at long last; 2, a new Palestinian leader, other than Sinwar in Gaza and Mahmoud Abbas, who's 18 years into a 4-year term in Ramallah; 3, a true willingness on the part of an American administration to exert the requisite pressure that needs to be exerted, which probably requires that it be the right second-term U.S. president, because no first-term U.S. president would risk at this point battling Israel and its supporters in the United States if there were still real political consequences. And the 4th factor is the ongoing willingness, as Jim mentioned, of the Saudis to continue to play. If those 4 things come together, things could look different. In Israel, it will be the case that any movement towards a negotiated solution will be met with ferocious opposition and perhaps violence by the religious Zionist faction. And I think that's something that those who consider change simply now just factor in as part of the calculus. It's likely, that a figure, kind of stolid gray figure like Gantz, is the kind of person who could pull off a negotiated solution. But in the vein of Nixon in China, Begin in Egypt, but I would put the odds as well below 20% that we will see that in the next 5 years.
Let me just interject one thing. First of all, I wish I even shared Dave's optimism that there's an itsy-bitsy, tiny, teeny chance that all these factors are going to get together and that it ain't going to happen as far as I'm concerned, but we'll see. It means a sea change in global politics. It means a sea change in American politics, Israeli politics, and Palestinian politics, etc. And what Hamas has demonstrated is the fact that any time that something like this comes down the pike, it's very willing to pull out all stops to make sure that it's not going to happen, that basically the maximalist demands will be put on the table again. Anything to drive the Israelis away. And what the Israeli right has demonstrated is pretty much the same thing. The one thing that I wanted to add, though, was this whole question about the way Israel is treating this, what happened on October 7th versus the way that I think most of the world would perceive it. And for the Israelis, they're treating it as if it's an existential crisis, a crisis that demands, that puts at risk the very existence of the state of Israel. It's as very, very similar to the overreaction of the Americans after 9/11, in which the United States basically pulled out all stops and declared a global war on terror and committed itself to Afghanistan and then off of Afghanistan to Iraq. What happened on October 7th, as horrible and horrifying as it is not an existential threat to Israel. And the idea that only the complete destruction of Hamas, which would entail the large-scale destruction of Gaza, is going to resolve the issue is something that I think, we can't accept at face value. It has to be looked at in a very different way, which is the fact that as horrifying as the situation was, Israel continues to exist as a state. Israel will continue to exist as a state. And that the ultimate solution, as both of us just said, the ultimate solution does lie in a two-state solution. And that a two-state solution is not an existential threat to the state of Israel. As a matter of fact, it's the very thing that will allow the survival of the state of Israel, the very thing that will allow for these sort of attacks to end. Now, we're asking the Israeli population to do something that right now the Israeli population is not committed to do, not willing to do, which is to support the idea of a Palestinian state after what happened on October 7th. But I'll just ask people here just to consider the fact that what the Israelis are doing is this massive overreaction, not only in the way they're performing militarily, but also in the way that they're interpreting events that have taken place.
And ultimately counterproductive to their own self-interests, I would just add.
Oh, and I agree with you, absolutely.
All right. On that note, I'll go ahead and end it here. Thank you all so much for joining us today and for your questions. Apologies if we didn't get to your question. We had a lot of great questions in the Q&A that we just didn't have time for. But I also want to thank Professor Myers and Professor Gelvin for providing so many important insights and context to this complex issue.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.